Okay, let's take a look at what bad fighting looks like when you're the one having to respond. So just to be clear here, this is what people do when someone starts a fight with them. Now, in the first section of the chapter, we spent a lot of time focusing in on what people do when they're the initiator of a conflict. And many of those habits that we covered in that section, people can probably easily relate with. This section gets less attention, but don't be mistaken. These tactics used to respond in a fight are just as toxic and destructive for a marriage. Now, there are really three main ways that bad responses typically look like in a fight. First, and perhaps the most common, is a defensive or blame shift response. So I'll explain what this looks like, and then I'll go into the underlying reasons why people instinctually do this. A defensive response probably doesn't take much to explain because you've probably seen it a bunch of times and you've probably done it plenty yourself. But in short, when someone confronts you in a conflict, when they accuse you of doing something wrong, you respond with a defense or an excuse of why you're not wrong. Or if you blame shift, then you shift the responsibility onto someone else. That could be blaming your spouse or pushing back on them. That could mean blaming someone else or a situation that you think was out of your control. These responses can sound like, well, it's because of so-and-so, or well, if you hadn't done this, or it could look a lot like a spew. Oh yeah, you think I did something wrong? Well, let me tell you about all the things that you've done wrong to me and why you have no right to come at me. Again, these can be super common ways that people respond, and some of you might be thinking, well, that's really the only way you can respond when you feel like you're being attacked and wrongfully accused. But remember, conflict has to be about understanding and resolution, not about being right and wrong. And in order to get understanding and resolution, we have to increase that conflict window to gain more helpful information. And in order to do that, we need stronger resiliency and rootedness to withstand the feelings of injustice and being wrongly accused. If you're able to do that, you'll actually discover that there's a lot more options open to you for resolution that are far more constructive and beneficial for the marriage. Now, let's take a step back here and understand why this happens. One common reason why people go defensive or blame shifty is because they have little confidence in the actual process of conflict itself. Real or perceived, they believe that they won't be able to be heard out and given a fair chance to be understood. So because they don't really believe that they'll have their say or to get their chance to be heard, they feel this compulsion to rush to defensiveness and to speak up out of fear that they won't have their chance. Now, if their fear is real, meaning that there is a tendency for their spouse to never really give them their turn to talk and really hear them out, then putting some structure in and some rules for fighting the way that this lesson is intended to can help restore that confidence in the way that fights go. In other words, if you know that there is a commitment and a dedicated time for you to be able to be heard, then it's easier to suspend your compulsion to become defensive because you can trust that you'll be heard out and listened to eventually. But if the fear is only perceived, in other words, your spouse hasn't really done anything to indicate that they won't give you a chance to be heard and has proven that they're willing to hear you out, then most likely you're rushing to defensiveness or blame shifting because it's a learned fight response when you are confronted in any conflict. That might mean it's something that you've learned from your past or your childhood, that people will label you and judge you without really giving you a chance to be heard out and understood. Again, this might be a form of negative projection where you assume that your spouse isn't going to give you a chance to be heard, so you react with defensiveness way too soon. Another reason why this happens so often is because of feelings of injustice or unfairness. If you have a lot of unresolved issues with your spouse, or if you've stuffed your issues over years and years, it can feel really hard to be resilient and to hear your spouse out when they have an issue with you. Everything in you might be screaming, oh, you have the gall to tell me that I've done something wrong to you when you've done all these things to me? You see, if you feel like your spouse owes you something like, say, $100,000 of emotional debt, and they come to you and say that you owe them what feels like to be $1,000, it'll take a lot of resilience to follow through on this process, to validate that $1,000 as still legitimate and to reconcile that $1,000, even though you feel like that $100K that's owed to you hasn't been reconciled by your spouse yet. But again, you have to remind yourself and ask yourself when you feel that injustice and unfairness well up inside you. Are you more interested in justice and truth in that moment of conflict? Or are you more interested in understanding and reconciliation? And can you trust that if you can offer that to your spouse, that they in turn will take note of your response and do the same for you when you need to communicate your hurts to them? All it takes a lot of times to shift out of these bad habits is for one person to be the stronger and bigger person to model healthy conflict for the other. Don't play down to your spouse's level of conflict. Play up to set a new bar for how conflicts ought to go in your marriage. Now, let's take a look at this from a different angle. Another common reason why people respond defensively is because they have little tolerance and resiliency when it comes to feeling guilt, fear, or failure. Because their spouse is accusing them of something, whether true or not, their spouse's perception is that they did something wrong. And when that happens, people tend to feel forced to respond defensively because they don't know how to sit in the discomfort of feeling guilt, failure, or the injustice of being wrongly accused. And if they can't withstand the exposure to those thoughts and feelings, they have to react quickly to change the perception to alleviate the discomfort of those feelings. This is one of the many reasons why those capabilities that we covered in the first chapter, like resiliency, is so important. A highly resilient person can suspend their need to defend and allow their spouse to think things that they believe are wrong or unwarranted long enough to listen and respond well. They can buy more time and expand that conflict window for longer, which in turn increases the chances of getting to a correction or a resolution. All right, let's move on to the second most common bad habit when responding in conflict, which is the withdrawal or the shutdown maneuver. This would maybe look like withdrawing from a fight and by walking away, or mentally and emotionally shutting down by going quiet, or detaching and mentally checking out from a fight. People tend to do this for a number of different reasons. First, it could be that they're trying to not escalate the conflict, so they decided that the lesser damaging to do is to not add fuel to the fire. But in doing so, because the core of the conflict never actually gets addressed or resolved, the pursuing spouse only builds up more anger and resentment, feeling like the withdrawing spouse is only avoiding their fights. So what ends up happening is it creates this kind of polarizing dynamic where one spouse is detached, emotionally cut off and avoiding fights, while the other one comes off as overly emotional, making conflicts probably larger than they ought to be and trying to engage fights a lot more. So again, a withdrawal maneuver might seem like the lesser of evils in a conflict at the time, but over time, without really addressing the underlying conflict, it causes much more damage in the long run for the marriage. Other reasons why people use this tactic is because they either don't really value themselves enough to speak up and to communicate in healthier, measured ways, or they simply lack the vocabulary and the insight to even know how to communicate. Whatever the case, the end result is still the same. Over time, a withdrawing spouse becomes more and more detached, disinterested, and avoidant in conflict, while the one pursuing fights becomes more resentful and unreasonable in conflicts because no issues are ever getting resolved or addressed. Now, the last response that we're going to cover is the fixer response. A fixer response is when a person responds by trying to fix a situation or trigger for a conflict as quickly as possible. Oh, you forgot to take the trash out again. Oh yeah, you're right. I'm sorry, I'll take that out right now. You see, they may have fixed the problem of the trash, but the underlying issue of the conflict, typically not feeling respected or important enough to be heard or listened to when it comes to things like taking out trash, that underlying issue is still there. The reason why people do this, I found, is for one of potentially two different reasons. The first is some people tend to gravitate and think only in terms of problems and solutions. If fixers are like hammers, every situation to them looks like a nail. Many conflicts are emotionally charged issues that require a different set of tools to resolve. So sometimes fixers just automatically go towards a fix because that's the only thing that seems to make sense to them. To resolve a conflict means to solve a problem. But as we'll see in later chapters, especially in chapters 8 and 9 when we talk about hurt-focused conflicts, the real fix requires a completely different set of tools. So when it comes to hurt feelings and emotions, people will tend to use a fixing hammer to resolve the situation, when really what they probably need is to use something along the lines of a screwdriver that might be a little bit more emotionally nuanced. Now we'll get into what a screwdriver tool looks like in later chapters when we get into resolving hurt feelings, but for now, just understand a really common reason for a fix and response is because people just don't have more tools at their disposal to do anything other than fix. Now, one of the other reasons why I found that people move all too quickly to a fix tactic is because they just aren't comfortable with emotions. Delving into the world of feelings like pain, sadness, anger, fear are things that seem overwhelming and unfixable. So naturally, it makes sense for those that fall into this category to avoid digging deeper into conflict and experiencing those emotions by shifting the focus to things that feel more fixable or solvable. Again, as you can see, emotional resiliency is required to be able to dive deeper into this emotional space. If we can expand that conflict window for longer and allow for longer exposure to the underlying emotions that drive a conflict, then what might seem initially impossible to fix or solve becomes more resolvable because we're giving ourselves more time to understand the issues at a more deeper level. Now, you might be able to tell that these responses tend to follow that same fight or flight lower brain response. A spew, defensive or blame shift response is a fight response. A stuff, withdrawal, and shutdown, that's a flight response. A leak or fix response is kind of somewhere in between. Now, it takes practice and repetitions to unlearn these habits and to retrain your brain out of these patterns. The skills that we learned from chapter 1 Regulation, processing, resiliency, and empathy are absolutely critical skill sets to have in order to not respond in these ways during a fight. Now, this is just the surface introduction of typical bad habits that come up in marital conflict. In later chapters of this lesson, particularly when we go into more specific rules for fair fighting, we'll get more into specifics and details of ways that fights can go bad, why they happen that way, and how to learn good preventative skills to keep our fights on track. In the next chapter, though, I'll cover how to use those mirrors for this metaphorical car of ours and how to account for issues that are kind of in our blind spots. In that chapter, we'll dig into understanding how your past hurts impact present conflicts. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.